We're here today with Professor Carlos Lopes, who's a professor at the Nelson Mandela School in Cape Town. Thanks for being here with us, Carlos, for our first Future Leaders program. As you know, the Development Leadership Dialogue brings current and future leaders together from across government, business, and civil society, with the idea of this interaction creating more strategic ways of thinking about tackling difficult development challenges. I'd like to start off by asking you, do you think this endeavor is important for future leaders like those attending this DLD program, that they work across different sectors and expose themselves to different approaches and ways of thinking? Does this, in your experience, help in creating and crafting and implementing better strategies when different perspectives are brought together in a strategic dialogue? And do you have any examples in your work, your policy advocacy work and policy leadership work, that how this can work?
It's badly needed. We have a situation where a lot of demand for transformation is actually curtailed by the lack of knowledge about the experiences. And it's very important for people to refer to something concrete, tangible, not just theory. And it's very much the possibilities of having these exchanges that gives people the confidence that they can know the concepts. They may actually engage in a robust academic or intellectual debate, but they also need the combination with the experience and practice that will allow them to actually implement things and be agents of transformation.
One interesting thing is in this regard is that people that come from different disciplines and perspectives often speak a different language. Do you find that when you have people in a room from different perspectives that finding a common language around discussing ideas has ever been a problem or more of a benefit?
I think this type of exposure is very disruptive, and not just on language, but also narratives.
Yes.
And I think that helps people actually pause and try to reflect on their own journeys and try to understand what is it that can be the contribution they can make, but also identify entry points that actually are impactful. And language is very important because the more you actually have a holistic view of what transformation means, what kind of changes are we talking about, what type of leadership makes a difference.
Yes.
It's very much enshrined in language and narrative. So I think this is actually very positive that they are exposed to so many different views.
That's interesting. What advice would you give to the future leaders that are at our program, and what approaches would you like to see them developing, just in general terms?
I think it's very important that when they have these few days of reflection, exchange, that they try to absorb as much as they can. So be a sponge first.
Yes.
And after that, it's very important to actually have a moment of introspection about what you have been exposed to and try to understand what are the dimensions that actually make the most difference in terms of context. We often generalize. Narratives tend to be universalized even. But it's the context that makes the difference. When people understand political economy dimensions, for instance, when they understand the peculiarities of the political process in a given country, that's when they will actually be able to make sense about what they have been exposed to. And I think that journey is very personal. And it's something that they have to go through after this course. And I think it's something that will probably entice them to come back.
Yes, that's a very good point. I mean, one of the main themes that we want to develop, or the sort of the core organizing concepts of these workshops, is for analysts to pay attention to variation. Both variation in performance across countries, but also within them as a source of not only thinking about why some things work in some contexts and not others, but even why within one country certain sectors perform more effectively than others. And so that's one of the things we're trying to promote in terms of a way of thinking. Moving away from universalistic theories, things can either be all good or all bad, but to really take variation within and across countries very seriously as a source not only of political economy analysis, but also of strategic policy thinking. So that sort of resonates with what we're trying to do. How important has it been in your career, this is something we're emphasizing a lot, to fail and learn from failure? Could you identify, for example, your best failure? And do you think there's a case for institutionalizing learning from failure in government?
I'm just finishing a function where I failed terribly, which was to be the High Representative of the African Union for partnerships with Europe.
Okay.
And I set for myself the ambition that this was going to be an opportunity to change the nature of the engagement of the African Union in order to be more cohesive in terms of pushing a certain number of integration projects that we are now undertaking, like the Continental Free Trade Area and others,
Right.
and make sure that the main objective of this engagement was to actually protect Agenda 2063, the strategic agenda of the African Union. And I realized that this was an ambition that very difficult to meet. First, because the Africans are divided, and its political economy in this instance is about trying to bring everybody under one tent,
Yes.
which proved to be impossible during my mandate at least. And second, I didn't realize that I was going to deal with a partner that engages in aggressive behavior when it's not really pleased with the agency demonstrated by the counterpart. And that was for me quite a lesson in terms of the need for one to be much more prepared and to actually protect yourself and your field in such a way that the various opportunities for negotiation are used with some savviness and that you understand the nuances of the other side, because they have nuances. They are not also under the same tent. And unless you understand the contradictions in both sides, you cannot really succeed. So that was quite a humbling experience that I just went through.
Yeah. And I imagine it's an experience of any great leader or strategic thinker to really embrace the fact that failure is an opportunity to do things better. How important, one last question. I mean, our theme this week has been the difference between wish lists, like the SDGs, and aspirational visions on the one hand, and on the other, strategies focusing on feasible priorities. Do you think there's a need for more work on this? And would you have suggestions on how to follow through on this idea? This idea that, a vision is not a strategy, it's an aspiration.
Well, I have been very much involved in setting up the Agenda 2063 of the African Union, and that is an aspirational agenda. It's quite long-term, and obviously you have to translate that into immediate practical steps that are very difficult to envisage with the horizon so long as 50 years when it was written. Now, obviously, I think normally we tend to replace the lack of action with more proclamations. And ambition is very different from just this sort of visionary documents that are emerging in these different international fora that tend to be just a replacement for lack of action. We have seen it in climate. We have seen it during the pandemic. We have seen it many times over the last years. And I think the SDGs are very much part of the same attitude of trying to embrace everything under the sun,
Yes.
wanting to change everything in just a very short period of time without actually believing in its implementation. It's basically a tactic
Yes.
of negotiators to try to replace their own lack of action.
Right. In that vein, I mean, what do you think, this is a policy question, which I know you're intimately involved in, what do you think are the main challenges of implementing the Africa Free Trade Agreement? And do you think there's a danger that it's been oversold the way it's been presented?
Well, what really made it possible was the realization that we were trying to implement an agreement, the Abuja Agreement of 1991, that wanted to have everything in one go. And realizing that you have to move with the ones that are ready. You really can't have these integration projects with this level of ambition working with the least common denominator. So the moment you make it just a matter of everybody being in agreement. You instead of creating the opportunities for consensus, you're just killing the initiative from day one. And that's exactly what happened with the Continental Free Trade Area for a period of about 10 years. It was just talk. Nothing was really happening. And I was part of the team that engaged in discussions about transforming it into a completely different approach from what was envisaged in this Abuja agreement of 91. And that difference was, let's move with the ones that are ready. And that's when you got sort of momentum, because a number of countries actually embraced it, and the rest had to follow. First in terms of adhering, and then in terms of ratification. Now we are at the stage where it's about protocols. Negotiating protocols is much more difficult for countries that have a certain degree of industrialization than for others, because they have bigger stakes in terms of how they position the different tariffs. And that's where we are. I think it's quite remarkable that we already have agreement of about 87% of tariffs. So we have some way to go, but I think if you compare the timeline of this particular agreement with similar experiments, including the European Union, you would see that the timeline is pretty reasonable.
So what Albert Hirschman might say, there is a bias for hope in this regard.
Yes.
Well, Professor Lopes, thank you very much for joining us, and we hope to engage with you much more in the future with the DLD. Thanks
My
very
pleasure.
much again.
Thank you.